All right. Okay, everybody. Hello and welcome. My name is Kate Travis, and I'm a freelance science journalist and managing editor of CASW Connector, an online library of resources on science writing hosted by the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. In addition to our panelists today, I'm joined by my Connector colleague, science journalist Betsy Ladajets, as well as Rosalind Reed, longtime executive director of CASW, who is retiring this year, as well as Megan Parker, CASW's new executive director, and who has officially been on the job for, I think, 9 days. So welcome, Megan.
Thank you.
The event today is part of our series of Connector Chats, each of which focuses on an aspect of science writing, brings us together to chat about it, rounds up resources on that topic, and then becomes a resource itself. I'm going to briefly show you the Connector website. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second. Let's see. Oops. Okay, this is the Connector. Is everybody looking at the Connector website? I hope. Yes. So this is the Connector website. We very much want you to find what you're looking for. So we've got a search box front and center for you. If you don't know what we have to offer, you can click some of the quick links here. You can see some of our recently added resources right here, as well as some that have upcoming deadlines. So I moved them up to the top. We also have links to tip sheets from past chats, as well as recordings of them. And then we have upcoming events and deadlines as well. You can see this event. And if you are interested in the topic of today's, I would clear your schedule for next Wednesday as well. There's a couple of times. All right. And then we also, so when you go in to search our library, we also have a lot of different ways that you can search for specific resources depending on your career stage, what topic of information you're looking for, if you're looking specifically for awards, or if you're looking for upcoming conferences or that sort of. So we've got nearly 500 resources in there. So we hope you check it out and find something useful. And if you know of a resource that you would like to suggest, you can always send it to us by clicking this big purple button, suggest a resource. And so, all right. So thank you, Beth. And Betsy just dropped in a link to all the resources there for you. So, okay. Today's topic focuses on elements of great storytelling about science, medicine, and health. And to tackle that topic, we've brought together 2 excellent people to talk to each other while we get to eavesdrop. Steve Padilla is a renowned writing coach and an editor at the LA Times, where he oversees Column 1, a series that showcases great feature stories. Steve is a frequent speaker and would be an incredible Connector Chat guest on his own, but we've invited him here to talk today with our title guest, Usha Lee McFarling. Usha is the national science correspondent for STAT, and she is the 2024 recipient of the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. Specifically, the award recognizes her work in recent years that has exposed and explained racial disparities in the US healthcare system, as well, and it also honors her dedication to mentoring journalists and, may I add, willingness to accept invitations to participate in events like this. But the Cohn Prize is just the latest award for Usha, whose work has been honored and recognized many, many times throughout her career. So to hear the story behind all these award-winning stories, I'll turn things over now to Usha and Steve.
Right. Thank you for the very nice introduction. And Usha, before I forget, congrats on the big award. So exciting and so well deserved. Let's start at the beginning here. There's so many things I want to ask. Oh, regarding questions. So I've got tons to ask, but you all have even probably better questions than I have, I'm sure. And Kate, we agreed they'll put them in the chat, right? And that we won't wait till the very end. That is, depending on how things go, we'll try to weave them in as we go along, right? So
yes, absolutely. And if you see in that chat, if you see questions that you also have the same question, feel free to drop an emoji or a thumbs up on that question, just so we know that multiple people are interested in it. So
yeah, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, of course. But let's start at the beginning, about even before we're writing, but just on finding stories, about coming up with those ideas, because I think that's one of the things that distinguishes your work, not just how you write about things, but what you choose to write about. Can you tell us a little bit about that process for you?
Yeah, sure. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with one of my favorite people in journalism, Steve, and one of my favorite organizations that's like personally done so much for me throughout my career. So thank you. Um, yeah, I guess it's stat we call it identifying story targets. And I think sometimes you have to put as much work into that as the writing, or nearly, at least be intentional about it. I'm really committed to not telling stories that have already been told or not just rehashing. I mean, I do think a lot of journalism is sort of the same story told over and over again, and people tune out. One example I would say was during COVID, and we just had so many stories, horrible stories about healthcare, heartbreaking stories about healthcare workers dying. You remember all the stories about the people banging their pans. Um, and in that time, and they were publishing names of people that were dying. And I just started to notice a lot of Filipino names showing up on those lists. And I was like, that's interesting. And I think it probably took me a couple days and I kept seeing it. So then I started looking, and there's a whole rich history. There's books written about, 25% of California's nurses are Filipino. So there's a large number and whole history of immigration, filling out gaps. But I started calling and talking to Filipino nurses, and it turned out that they were just dying in large numbers. A lot of them work in ICU, a lot of them work in nursing homes, a lot of them do double shifts. So they were going like from the ICU. So they were really highly at risk. And then it turned into a story also about a lot of the tensions because they just felt, as they have for decades, they weren't getting visibility or attention. They were it was like the white nurses that were on television. So
Yeah.
we were the first one to report that story. Later, many people did. It just became hugely obviously with the demographics. But that just came from noticing something. And I think have your curiosity hat on. Just if you think something interesting, other people probably will too.
Well, I have some other questions I want to ask about the Filipino nurse story, particularly one amazing paragraph where you frame everything. But before we get to that, I want to, on this notion of looking for the story. A common technique is to focus on an individual person in a story. The nurses piece is really more of an ensemble cast, appropriately so. But when you have zeroed in on one person, could you talk about how do you cast your movie? How do you find that lead character? Because I think there's a tendency of sometimes we grab the first person who will really talk to us. And sometimes there's considerable reporting going into finding the character before you even report their life.
Right. Right. I think you have to be careful about grabbing the first person. And I know sometimes you have to do that. I remember as a young reporter, like covering 4th of July parades, and you're just like grabbing anyone
Well,
that'll
that's
talk to
different. Yeah, but yeah.
you. Right. But in this, because you might end up with someone that is kind of boring or doesn't have a lot of insight into the issue, or maybe has a problematic, like an arrest or something in their background. So you do not want to invest that time to do that. So we used to, at the time when I was at the Times, we used to call it gathering string. So I will look for things. One thing that the best thing about the pandemic for me was all these webinars that were happening when we were locked in our house. So I was like coming up to speed on this new beat on racial inequality, watching these webinars. And the great thing about that is you see how people speak in real time. And, maybe there's some big fancy speaker like the dean of XYZ med school, but they're kind of boring. And then there's like a assistant professor of cardiology who I remember there was one, she was the mom of this CNN reporter who got arrested by the police when those protests were in Minnesota. And she was so dynamic. She's talking about her son, she's talking about cardiology. And so I was like, she's a great person to interview. She's full of stories, she's full of energy. So you can, and now everyone's like on a webinar, right? you can check me out, you can check Steve out, you can check someone out and kind of see what they're like. So some people that I've profiled, I kind of saw them tell their story first. And then of course I just check their background, make sure there's nothing, untoward. That's very rare. And then
But it does happen. You do discover, yeah.
does happen. And then maybe if you have the time, maybe do a pre-interview, maybe talk to them briefly about something else before you go all in. The profile of Rachel Hardiman, I'd spoken to her for news stories, just briefly to get a comment about a study she's done, probably 4 or 5 times before I did that story. It kind of built up. And I think the bar is pretty high for me to just profile one person. There has to be a lot to them. They have to really exemplify an issue or have a unique personal story that I think is worth telling. And that takes a lot of research.
Yeah, but that's a real key point. I mean, I think sometimes we grab one person because we think, oh, I want to focus it on, it'll make it easier if I focus on one person. But as you say, maybe they're boring, or maybe they don't really reflect all the different issues you're trying to do. One thing I found helpful, by the way, with reporters when they do focus on one person, if they want to watch them in action, is that they'll do, as you say, kind of a pre-interview to find out, okay, where was your mom born and where'd you go to school, that kind of boilerplate stuff. So that way, when they actually watch them in action, they can just shut up and watch, right? And not interrupt them while they're talking to a patient.
That's a great point. And I think those pre-interviews are really important because, first of all, you can get a ton of stuff in your notebook and background. And the second thing, when you do get to go and meet them in person, they kind of trust you or they know you. So you're starting along like a little bit closer to them in the conversation than you would have. And what I love is if you get so much stuff in that pre-interview, you could almost write the story. And then everything you get live is gravy. Like you really enjoy the trip. You're not as nervous. You kind of know you have the story. And then you're and sometimes it'll change because your in-person experience is like, wow, that was so amazing. I'm gonna throw away what I thought was a lead. But I think in these cases, I don't think we have it on the list, but I did a profile of an ER doctor who was right through the worst of New York City's pandemic. And he's not only like Black from a really poor neighborhood, really unlikely that he got into medicine. He also stutters. And he was trying to sound the alarm and no one was listening. And he had made up raps on YouTube. I mean, he talked about how he cried every time he called that, a family that the patient had died. This was when people couldn't even go in the hospital to say goodbye. And I think, it was such a hard story, but I loved writing it. And I think the point, you want to get to a point where you have so much stuff, you can't even include it all. Right. So you're triaging because you're like, oh my God, I have so much stuff. I have so many anecdotes. I have so many good quotes. Like, you don't want to be trying to write it with like piecing together this meager amount of stuff you have. You want to be like flooded with good stuff so you can pick and choose the best for a profile.
Yeah, well, that relates to something I was going to ask about it regarding the reporting. One thing that distinguishes a lot of your work is the level of detail. So there's one piece, I think it was posted, the activist Rachel Hardiman, and there's a reference to her handing out iPads to some moms that they're supposed to fill out a form on these iPads. And you don't just call them iPads, you call them shiny iPads. I noticed. And then in the Filipina nurse story, there's this paragraph that mentions a nurse by the name of Jem Scorp. And it's interesting. One way we could describe how they were dealing with issues, we could say that, the nurse was very busy or the nurse was rushing from one room to another. But you have a very specific way of describing what Jem Scorp dealt with. At the peak of this is what you wrote. At the peak of the outbreak, Scorp was hearing 10 code blue calls each shift. I'm curious how that description came about, because that is so much more vivid than saying really busy. Or 20 calls a day. At the peak of the outbreak, Scorp was hearing 10 code blue calls each shift.
Yeah, so it's been a minute since I talked to Jem Scorp, but what I tend to do is I just let people talk. And once you get them started, I mean, sometimes it's annoying because they won't stop, like when you're on deadline trying to do a quick story, but oftentimes, once you have someone's trust, and we can talk about that, people want to share their stories. And especially, I think if people have been traumatized or in pain, like all of the healthcare workers during the pandemic. And so what I remember from that is just hearing, I mean, I was just kind of shocked. I just had no idea what it was like inside those ICUs at that time, when they had the hospital, the bodies piling up. And I just let him talk. And I just, I don't write my interviews. I write really quickly. I just write everything because I don't know what I'm going to use until the writing. And again, I
Yeah.
get a lot of stuff I won't, he told me like tons of stuff that I will never be able to use or wasn't able to use. But yeah, and I try to look for those little details that, it's showing, not telling.
Yeah.
Um,
So when you've got so much stuff, and one of my favorite phrases in a newsroom is "I've got great stuff." That's when clear out A1. When you hear
yeah.
someone say that. Um, I know that's very print centric, but hey. Um, so what's your process? Okay, so you've got all your cool stuff, but how do you figure out what the story is, even before you begin writing? Because I mean, um, one thing I always preach in my lectures is, if you know what you want to say, you'll figure out how to say it. And often a lot of people jump to the how first because that's the fun part, right? That's the writing. But how do you figure out what your story is?
Yeah, I guess I am thinking about that as I'm interviewing. I also think it's pretty important that I don't stop. I don't, too many people feel like, okay, I'm done reporting and now I'm going to stop writing. And so I am not afraid to go back and call someone if I didn't get the thing I needed that emerged in writing. But
Mhm.
I usually have, I think, themes that I want to cover, and I want to make sure I have all that material. Sometimes the end just pops into my head very early, even before I write the lead. Um, but I kind of think about the arc of the story and the main things I want to say. And then with all my great stuff, I usually like separate out my interviews by person, and I will just go through literally with a highlighter or a different, I love green and purple ink because I usually write out in blue. So now I use a different color ink, and I will circle, or even in the midst of an interview, when someone says a great quote, I put huge stars by it because I don't want to lose it or forget it.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes I will just take those great quotes. I think quotes are other people's voices are like the beating, living heart of a story. So I will literally put those quotes into a Google document and like kind of write to and around the quotes. Like they are
Mhm.
the featured parts. It might not show in the end, but I love to have those real voices.
Well, one thing that
What, oh,
distinguishes a lot of the quotes, I think, with yours. I'm sorry, Kate, did you have a question or something you want to
yeah,
throw
I
in?
was just going to say we have a question from Priyanka who asks about when you're looking at those when you have multiple people with similarly important and interesting stories. I'm reading now, especially patients and community members. She writes, I've found myself sometimes picking up the most heartbreaking ones or someone who has experienced the most challenges as the lead. They're compelling. How do you make those decisions of which people to use, what quote to use, those sorts of decisions?
It's a great question. I mean, I struggle a lot with that. I kind of feel like once I do interview someone and they give me all that time, I know they're going to be really disappointed if they're not in the story. So I like try to find ways to get them all in, and my editor's just like, we don't have room, get rid. Sometimes you feel like you need someone because of their gravitas or their title, that they really can speak to something. Um, I find there's a recency effect. If I'm working on something for a long time, oftentimes the people I interview last end up getting in the story. And I don't know if this because the quotes are fresh in my mind or because I've already like sort of written or outlined and I know what I want to say. And so they're telling me the things I need. And then I sometimes feel bad because I had gone at the beginning to the most important, people, like the lead people that you would talk to on that story. And sometimes they don't make it in. So I think it's something to think about and try to be intentional about. And maybe if you do that vetting beforehand, you're not interviewing too many people that you then have to just cut out. But I will, when that happens, I'll send a note the night before the story comes out, just saying, I'm sorry, I wasn't able, or I blame my editor usually.
That's always the best
Yeah,
approach.
yeah,
Yeah.
my business editor. I wasn't able to get you in the story, but what you told me just helped. I feel very, because a lot of times I'm writing about really touchy issues. So it really helped me be confident that I could talk about this in such a public way. And I'd say like 90% of people, at least they respond, they seem fine and they understand, especially if you've explained kind of your process.
Wow, that's an excellent thing to let people know that. That's very gracious. I've noticed a lot of your quotes that you do use tend to be fairly short, fairly punchy. That like that nurse that we mentioned earlier with the 10 code blue calls quote. I've never seen so much death. That's the whole line. you know, he's um, the one thing I've noticed with quotes, by the way, is a buddy of mine at the paper, the Times, mentioned that often they're not good for expository material. If it's if you have exposition, usually you can say that faster than the source can.
Yeah.
And a great observation from one of my colleagues, Rosanna Shah, who writes on science and has this award-winning book out, California Against the Sea. She says whenever she sees a long quote in a science story, her assumption is the writer doesn't actually understand what the source says. Yeah, right? Because they just they can't figure out how to translate it, so they just hand the microphone over to the
Yeah,
source.
like when I wrote about dark matter, which you see none of those stories are on the sheet for people to read.
But you don't do that in any of the work here at all. Someone asked about, mentioned the issue of one of the persons mentioned the issue about building trust. Can you talk about that? Since you're dealing
Yeah.
with so many intimate and heavy duty subjects here.
Yeah. And I just want to follow up on the quotes before I answer that, which is
Oh, yeah.
I've learned to be ruthless with like, I try to shorten my quotes. I use quote fragments because you really have to respect, even writing online when you would say like there's no page length to fit into, we have to be respectful of people's time. And so I do think the thing I hate to see most in other writing is that like an introduction, like the reporter saying something and the quote just repeating what was just said. Like it
Yeah.
was, they were really worried about the hurricane's effect on medical supplies. I'm really worried about the hurricane's effect on medical.
Oh, you
And
see that all
you
the
see
time.
that a
In fact,
lot.
but you know how to deal with that? This is a good self-editing technique, folks. After you've got your draft, and I do this with all the stories I read, you're not even really reading, just look for the quote and then read the sentence directly above it. And that's when you catch that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's usually hard to do on the draft, but you can easily do it on the when you're polishing the gem.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll
Yeah.
also, break up, um, use quotes from different parts of the interview, with an interrupting with, their so-and-so said, and then you can use a second part. So you're not using ellipses. I just want to make it as smooth and easy to read as possible.
Well,
Um,
that comes across in the work because they really come across like the garlic. They just add that extra little flavor, without dominating too much.
yeah. And I really love to have a person in that segment ending on what they said, like a little quote. Well, we can talk about ending of stories later, but
Yeah.
I hate to just end something with said, so and so, the president of Allied, Allied whatever steel
Yeah.
company, because it's just
Mhm.
you want to just like after a title, just I wish no one had a title,
Yeah.
because it's so long now and people have three. It just slows everything down, and then so
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of perk up that paragraph again with like
Mm.
a quote or a quote fragment at the end.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing I've noticed that you use sometimes, speaking of quotes, is actually a dialogue where you have people talking to each other. And that's to me, I've always thought that's just a great technique that's not used nearly enough.
Yeah, it's not used nearly enough, but you just have to be in real time writing what both people are saying and, maybe jotting down like, smiled or, looked away as he said, just see. And I think, we want to suggest things people to read. I think reading fiction is great for that. You just
Mhm.
see Raymond Carver, Hemingway, some of these amazing, just so short and, well, not short, but, some of the Victorian writers, but it's just amazing because you're just in the room,
Yeah, yeah,
like
just
you're
yeah,
reading,
when you dialogue is
reading
like
the
putting a movie
character.
in your story. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but anyway, but going back to trust. So on how do you build that? Because you get people to tell you the darndest things.
Yeah, trust is hard. The number one thing I would suggest is getting somebody that you know and that trusts you to make the introduction. Like if you're trying to talk to like a community member that's been harmed in some way, um, if someone they know and work with, know trust you, then they can vouch for you and speak for you, and then don't violate that trust, right? Because then you're going to get two people mad. And also, if I'm dealing with someone, which I do a lot, that hasn't ever been interviewed or doesn't deal with the media, I really explain, here's what I want to do. And I don't know, like most reporters, I guess, are just dying to use like the most great stuff they get. But I will find that once people trust you or start talking, they will share everything, including like stuff about like their colonoscopy or all these intimate details. And so I will often be like, okay, listen, this is going to be all over the world. Like this is going to be shit. This is going to be out, right? And once it's out, we can't bring it back. So like, are you okay sharing that? Just to make sure. And oftentimes they're like, yeah, I want people to know. like, you better put that in there. So I'm like, okay, so
Okay.
I make sure.
Mhm.
I think I'm fortunate now that I've been covering this beat for a while, that I think some people know me from my work, or I can send a story. But it is still hard. When you're dealing with issues of race, there's so much pain and trauma, and especially like older generations that have had to just button down, keep going, keep their, keep their head straight, just do the work, don't complain, that find it difficult to speak. And I'm mixed race, but I'm not Black. And so, I just ask people, and it's still hard. Like, I wanted to do a story about, I'm going to St. Louis for something else. And I wanted to do a story about a community group I'd heard about that's doing some amazing work. And first of all, it's hard to get in touch, right? Because they don't have PR people. They're not like a big university. And then when you do get in touch, they're like, who are you? You've never heard of STAT, and they're busy. And it's funny because on one hand, I have people knocking on my door being, please write a story about our work. And then I have ones where people are like, don't have time for me, don't know who I am, don't want to get involved. And it's frustrating, but I also understand it. So I'm persistent, but then I also, like, I've given up on them. I can't send any more emails. It's like, just maybe it'll happen in the future.
We have
Okay.
we have
Oh
another
yeah.
question that's
What do we
gonna
have?
lead, I think, into where you were heading, the story that you were heading toward next. I'm not sure, but Sally asks, at this point in your career, how do you treat the issue of health inequity in terms of the nut graph that you use to describe it? Do you assume readers already know the outlines of this, and do you try not to repeat, or are you writing for the new audience each time?
That's a great question. I'm really bad about nut graphs. I have to be reminded to put them in. It's a really good question. I think I
Or
have to
maybe
go.
just in terms of like, particularly when you're, when you're shining a light on inequities in the U.S. healthcare system, where do you start with your assumption level for your readers?
Well, I do always try to assume that this person's has never read read a story by me, or maybe, especially with my audience, maybe never read about health disparities. And there's some standard, like, key studies that everyone cites, like Black doctors are more likely to treat Medicaid patients. There's only 5% of doctors are Black versus their population. There's many studies that show racially concordant care. Sorry, I'm using jargon, which I hate. If you're cared for by someone that understands your culture, that you're going to do better, including, like, babies live, and people live longer and they get their flu shots and all these things. So I will drop in those stats, usually very quickly, with a link, just like, okay, if you don't believe me and you need some evidence. I think evidence is really important, because I do think that there's a lot of people who just don't think this is true, that even many physicians, that race influences healthcare and healthcare outcomes.
Well, Usha, I find it interesting where you say you don't do well with nut graphs, because actually you do. They're just not in the standard, fourth paragraph nut graph position. And I have two examples, and I want to share with everyone, and this might refresh your memory, because what's interesting about both these is that they reflect writing with authority, and I think that builds upon the level of reporting and on trust. And this first one, this first two sentences or so, is from a piece that you did about the inaccuracies with oximeters, pulse oximeters, and how they were influenced by skin color, skin tone. And you basically say, hey, there's a problem with these things, and then ask this question: just why it has taken so long for this issue to gain traction with medicine? To explore the question, Stat spoke with people who will be speaking to the FDA panel, that she references a panel in this story, or have been thinking deeply about the question. Here's the cool part. Like most things involving race in America, the answer is complex and sometimes painful. To some, it's a collision of science, history, and culture occurring within a society and medical system that may value convenience and low cost over the health of some of its most vulnerable patients. And along those lines, when you were writing about the Filipino nurses, you were trying to explain, without going into stereotype, well, why are there so many Filipino nurses? And what's their role? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And you wrote this: Filipinos are famous for and justly proud of their nursing acumen. The history of Filipino nurses in the United States is a long and complicated one, a symbiotic relationship born of war and colonialism, as some see it, racism, and the exploitation of a critical medical workforce, that has been hesitant because of cultural norms to complain about poor workplace conditions. So I just love that stuff. So how do you do that? You have these sweeping things. There's another example from the Hardiman piece profile as well. How do you write such things?
Well, this is funny. I went to a college that didn't have any requirements outside your major. So I never took a history class. And now I'm like kicking, like, what was I like? Why do you let 20-year-olds, like, why do you not give them any advice? So they, don't get a full education. So I love history now. And I love, like, you can't understand anything about race in medicine without understanding, like, as Hannah Nicole Jones would say, like, centuries of American history. And so I love looking into those things and learning. But then of course you can't take like 2 books that you read and fit them in your article, right? So you have to like just distill it and synthesize it. So I kind of just put it aside, like learn it all and put it aside and then let it rise to the top. Like, what are the top line things that I took from that? But again, it's born from the research, right? And the reporting and the reading or talking to experts about that history.
But in both those examples I shared, you never wrote, comma, he said or she said, comma, according to experts, And so I'm curious about how you feel you can do that. And do you get pushback from editors who say, yeah, but who says this?
Yeah, no, because I feel like it's, again, I use links to document often if I feel like there's any question. But this is something, and I think it's as I matured as a writer and felt more confident in this era, and also working at a place where I'm following in the footsteps of Helen Branswell and Sharon Begley, who both also won the Victor Cohn Award. They are, Sharon's passed away sadly, but they are just they know so much and they know that it's true. And so they just distill and they speak with authority in their writing. And I have to say, when I first started reading some of their stories, I was kind of like, where's the he said, where's the she said? Like a little shocked, like, what are they doing? But I think I've sort of, I realize it's such a great thing. It really helps the reader. It shortens a story to be declarative. And you can only do that if you're really confident and you've reported the hell out of a topic.
And what does it say about your relationship with your editor that you're able to do that?
Well, they see, since there's 3 of us at Stat who do that and more, I see it in other younger writers too. I think they really support it, like this. I don't know if it's being an online publication. I just feel like this more directly, like you're speaking to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if there's any question or doubt, I would attribute it. Or if it's something really controversial. But I think these facts are just, I don't think anyone would quibble with those, anyone reasonable that's just willing to think about evidence and history would quibble with any of those. I don't
I'm
think.
going to throw another, Kate, I'm going to go to you for questions in just a sec, but I want to throw one more at Usha here. This is kind of in this area of a nut graph that's sweepy, and it's describing this researcher, Rachel Hardiman, and there's no attribution here, but you're talking about how she reacts, how people are reacting to her. And you wrote, it's unusual to hear in academia, but Hardiman often centers the words love and joy in her research talks. This last year, though, and particularly the last few months of public attacks on Black scholars, has been filled with a different emotion, grief. Because doing the work she thinks is necessary to save Black lives may mean leaving only the university that trained her, but also groundbreaking. I'm going to read that again. Because the work she thinks is necessary to save Black lives may mean leaving not only the university that trained her, but also the groundbreaking center she birthed and even the city she loves dearly. What breaks her heart even more are the darker moments when she fears it may not be possible at all. Again, there's no sea shed at any of that.
Yeah, I guess that was just from, I've seen like a million academic talks and I don't hear people talking about love and joy like ever. So I was like, okay. And then it was a lot of that other stuff was just because I wanted to do this profile on her, but then the pandemic kept rearing up and I had to cancel. And she got this huge amount of money from Blue Cross to run a center. So I wanted to do it that time and the pandemic. And so I finally got to go and we scheduled it because she's so busy. It was like 3 months in advance. And then like 2 weeks before, she's like, I don't think I can do it. I think I just don't, and she was just explaining how upset she was, and we talked all through that. And then I was like, at first I was like, oh darn, I guess. And then I thought, wait a minute, this is like if she's willing to open herself up to me, this is an even better story.
Mhm.
And she's like, I wish you had done the story like 3 years ago when I was so happy and everything was hopeful. But in the end, she was like, no, I think this is like it's good we're doing this now. And so many people that work in DEI emailed me and they're like, I'm Rachel too. I'm Rachel.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Kate, I'm sure we have some questions that I'm missing. What's next?
We have a huge pile of questions that people submitted before this talk, and I think so. One that I'm sort of curious about, and this is back a little bit, but it's to ask Usha how you came about and conceived of the Embedded Bias series, and yeah, just kind of the
Okay.
origins of that and how you worked up the idea and the stories.
Okay. Well, one thing I've not done yet is credit my editor, Gideon Gill, because he's just really incredible. Sometimes I turn in such a long story and he's able to dredge out like what the story is within like all that stuff I write. And I have to credit him with Embedded Bias. He just one day said, like, I don't get it. Like, we can't use race over here, but we're supposed to use it over here. And he's like, I don't like, when can you use race? Like, because some people are like, you have to use it. And other people are like, you can't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so I was like, wow. And I think I was too deep into the reporting and the stories to like ask that top line question. And then he said, this just is coming up with these algorithms. And so I just started looking into it. And then we have this amazing, my co-writer, Katie Palmer's our kind of AI and health tech reporter. And she was kind of dealing with it because these algorithms are creeping into machine learning and AI. So they might be like very deeply embedded into medicine even more because all that stuff is invisible. It's like these black boxes where doctors just say, if this, then that, without really analyzing like if Black, not kidney disease, for example. So it kind of grew and spun out of control into a 9-part series that we weren't expecting, but it had so much nuance and complexity that we decided to break out different parts. But it really started with that one really good, insightful question. And I think that kind of goes back to what we started with, Steve, where it's like, where did the story ideas come from? And, like a lot of reporters on this call, you're probably like, oh, my editor has an idea, but I have to say a lot of times they are good ideas because they can take a step back, from where you are. And, that turned out to be a great idea.
Sometimes it happens. Kate, you got another one there you want to share? And you're on mute, so there you are.
I think that, and this is to bounce back to what you were talking about, that the kind of like writing with authority and making statements. I think I've had an editor say that the whole point of your reporting was to feel confident in what you could say without having to quote absolutely every thing. And Laura actually writes, I'm curious how that approach lands with readers. She says, I've had at least one case where a reader called my heavily reported piece an op-ed when I wrote from my reporting without attributing. Have you had any reader feedback on kind of on your writing in that way, where it's sort of?
Well, I get the standard like, oh, you're a racist, you hate white people. And I'm like, well, a lot of my family's white people, kind of love them. But but it's not ever usually anything really like deeply intelligent. I haven't had like anyone sort of say this specific thing. Not to say that people don't think that, but I feel like it's worth it to just err on the side of like authority when you feel confident. But I do see that it can be uncomfortable if it's like I was on Deadline this morning on this hurricane IV bag shortage. I know nothing about this. I know nothing about this at all. And I did not feel like I could be authoritative. So there's he said, she said, like a million links in the story to the FDA, to everybody. So I don't do it unless you feel confident and you really know the topic.
Yeah. I think a common problem, or not problem, but let's just say problem, That's not, that sets it down the wrong word, wrong path. Common challenge, shall we say, I think for writing, let's say, science stories, is you've got the science and then you've got human beings, people, human stories. How do you blend the two? I think that's a challenge for some because they can write one or maybe they write the other, but how do they do this?
Yeah. Well, we talked about profiles and like how I rarely do that because I think one problem when you're writing about race or anything really touchy, I'm sure sexual assault would be the same. If you just have one person's story, as horrible or as like as much as you've confirmed it, I think it's really easy for people to just discount it and say, well, that was just that person. I'm sure that doesn't happen all the time. That's unusual. She must have asked for it, like those things that people say.
Mhm.
And so like I did a story on how Black residents, which are only 5% of the nation's medical residents, are terminated at rate of 25%, right? So they're like basically like just ushered out of medicine right when they're about to finish. And if I just had one resident that was fired, people could sort of say she must have done something wrong. She must have been unsafe or, but I had like 8 who were on and off the record willing to tell me their story. And then I got some statistics that were the American Association of Medical Colleges was trying to keep on the QT, but I was able to like get them out. So I think the numbers speak a lot. They back up the personal stories, but you need the personal stories to make people care about those numbers.
But when you're putting such a piece together, do you find that the hard facts, the science, the stats, that those are the vertebra, that establish the structure of the piece, and then you are squeezing in the people, or do you start with the people and then you put in the science? Or
I think it's definitely the people, and then the numbers go into that like sweeping nut graph.
Mhm.
Like it's like a funnel where the stories and the, what's happened to people, how it impacts them, how it impacts medicine in general.
Mhm.
And then, here's the evidence.
Yeah. Let's talk about anecdotal leads, since so many people like to write them. Although one of my tips on anecdotal leads is don't use an anecdotal lead, by the way, just want to get that on the record. But when you do use, and you don't always use them, but when you do, what are you looking for? How do you decide if you are going to use a scene and what you need in that scene?
Yeah, it's so funny because I've been in journalism long enough that it was like anecdotal leads, never use them, always, it's this pendulum that shifts back and forth. I do think sometimes they're so long and they're like overused. So I don't know if and I'm trying to use more declarative things, but I think if it's snappy and eyebrow raising, but
Mhm.
also like tells you the story in a miniature way, or foreshadows what you're going to say. And
that's what works. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's
Because one problem I find as an editor, looking at raw copy or just reading just any publication, is I'll see anecdotal leads that are terrific in terms of being an anecdote, but they're for the wrong story. I mean, they're about story A. They're a story. It's an anecdote about a hot dog, but then you keep reading the stories really about hamburgers. But the writer, she had a really cool hot dog anecdote, so that's why she used it. You see that all the time.
It has to be in service of the story.
Exactly.
And I know it's being edited and I get like a lot of stuff gets cut out and I'm like, my heart's like bleeding onto the desk and I'll never survive this. And how can we cut that? And then literally like once it's published, I'm like, oh, that looks pretty good. Like, and I don't even like all that other I'm like, that was a really good decision, so if you take a step away, and I usually can't until it's out,
Yeah.
I'm like fiddling with it up till we'll get to self-editing. I'm fiddling it up until even if it's after it's posted in our pre-online thing.
Well, you also told me that you actually start writing while the reporting's still going on. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I've started to do that because I realize like a lot of times I do all this reporting that I don't need. I over-report. I'm sure it helps in some way, but being more just try, to be more efficient, I've realized like, let me start writing and see what I have, and then decide if I need to talk to that like healthcare economist, or if I need another like real person that this happened to. And a lot of times, like I don't know, maybe if I had them, they would have ended up in the story and I would have written it differently. But a lot of times, like you don't need them. And then it saves you the heartache of writing a bunch of stuff that gets cut. And then sometimes in the writing, this doesn't happen all that often, but it's like you need something totally different that you never realized. And, that's good to know like then, as opposed to like after your editor reads it and,
Mhm.
sends it back and tells you need that.
Right, right. I did see one question fly by that I was going to ask anyway. So what's your method for structure? How do you figure out the structure of a story? And you mentioned at one point that the ending will come to you fairly early. I think that's a very valuable thing to think of the ending while you're writing the beginning. It gives you a target.
Yes. Sometimes it will. Um, like with the Rachel story, I was struggling because I also was like, this is super depressing. Like, we're never going to fix race relations in America, basically. Like, um, and it was funny with her because after she didn't want to do the story because of, she was so upset. And then I did go up there, and then she's so busy, which my whole story talks about. They very kindly like set up interviews with like all of her mentees, mentors, like different experts. And we went down to this sad square where George Floyd died, and not with her, with someone else. And I talked to her, like, we had this like 45-minute interview set up, and I'd flown up there for like 3 days. And then she was like, I'm just so sorry, all this stuff's come up and I'm really busy, but hopefully you get all this other stuff you need. And I was like, oh my God, this is just a disaster. Because I don't know, I wanted to see her, I don't know. I mean, a lot of academics are just sitting at their computer, but I wanted to like see her in action. So then we did go to the birthing center where she did her research. And so that was really useful. And then I think she felt bad because another thing I do is if I'm doing a story, I'll try to take a late flight out on the last day. So if something else comes up or something I haven't anticipated that I want to see, and so she was like, "Oh, you're not leaving till 4?" And I literally had nothing to do that day, right? And I was like, "Yeah, I'm not leaving till 4." She goes, "Okay, I'll come meet you at your hotel and we can talk a bit more." And I think this is why she never has any time, because that turned into like a 3-hour chatting, having coffee. And then I had this whole thing about the Mississippi River running through Minnesota. And I'm kind of obsessed with like where the Mississippi starts. And I was like, wanted the Mississippi in my story because she's so Minnesota. And I was like, do you want to just walk? Because you can walk across it. I don't know if anyone's been there. It's beautiful. Walk across it. And there's these old mills. And she started telling me about how she used to, with her baby, and the mills used to be like decrepit and filled with homeless people, and now they're like gleaming condominiums, and it's like everyone wants to live there. And we were talking about the whole thing, like a bald eagle flew over. It was like a TV show of a reporter, like all the things you needed like were happening. And so on the plane, I was just like, I knew that was the end, because it was like, I think it says like, in this storied city on a historic stretch of river, everything changes. And Rachel Hardiman's counting on it. And it just kind of came to me. And then I don't always know the end, but it's such a kind of relief when you do. Because it's like seeing the end of a 5K or something. You're like, I'm going to make it. I can get there from here. And if you don't know the end, you don't know if you were going to get there, right? But you don't know how you're going to get there. And you're probably going to run more than 5K because you're going to go all these sideways.
Actually, I'm going to read the end of that story for everybody real fast here. Okay. Hardiman recalled pushing her daughter on a stroller here past the hulking mills that produced Pillsbury and gold medal flour a century ago, when Minneapolis was the flour capital of the world. Those long abandoned mills are now being converted into artist lofts and gleaming condominiums. It's clear on this historic stretch of a storied river and city, and in this historic moment, that everything changes. Hardiman is counting on it. I'm a big sucker for no quote leads, by the way. I challenge people to end stories in their own voice. And that just nails it. But that also does something interesting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about rhythm. And if I may share another example from the Hardiman profile, what's going to happen here is a fairly short sentence, then a medium sentence, and then a long sentence. But the long one, like the Mississippi, works, and I think the length of it, and there's certain repetition here that build up the notion of just how busy she is. So I'm curious, I want to share this with everybody and have you tell us about how you use rhythm and that. Since then, her career has seen a stratospheric rise, period. She's become a full professor at the University of Minnesota in just 7 years, period. Now the long sentence. She started a Center for Anti-Racial Research and Health Equity, funded with a $5 million grant from the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, And she's inundated with requests from researchers who want to work with her, students who want her mentorship, journalists who want to interview her, blue ribbon panels that want her on board, and just about every group imaginable that wants her and only her to give a talk at their event.
Yeah.
Okay, how'd that come about?
I mean, the more I talked to her, and it was funny because for a while she put up this email bounce back that was like, no, I cannot talk to you about this. No, I can't, like basically, no, I cannot solve racism. No, I cannot educate you. It was just like, duh, 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 duh. So I think I kind of took it from that because it just makes you go, whoa, like she's being hit from every angle. And I wanted to kind of convey that. Like I wanted to leave the reader with some of that fatigue at the end of the sentence.
And that's why one single sentence conveys that as opposed to a bunch of separate little sentences.
Yeah, like there's no breaks, there's no periods, there's no semicolons. It's just like da 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 da. And I think about rhythm a lot. I really think everyone, even like short news stories, I think people should just read their stories aloud because you hear repetition, you hear things that are clunky. And I sometimes like moving a word will just make me so happy. And I don't know if anyone else would notice. I think we all have I'm not musical, but I have an ear, I think, for language and how it should sound and cadence. And I think that's part of great writing is hearing it.
Yeah, I would encourage people as you read her work, look at that. You'll see often 3-word sentences, 5-word sentences, 9-word sentences, and they're often used to make a real significant point in the work. Kate, I've been hogging the questions here. Let's go back to you.
Oh, that's okay. I think one of the questions that a couple people submitted earlier is, these pieces are just wonderful, and being able to get into that depth with a single source is so, it really is tremendous. I think you were reminding me of a feature story I wrote 100 million years ago, where I was a field trip to a research center where I had a very prescribed tour of like, now we'll do a lab tour. Now you'll meet with this person. Now you'll meet with this person. Now you'll sit down and talk with the PI for an hour. My flight wasn't till 5 p.m. and he didn't know what to do with me. So he was like, you want to go get a coffee? Sure. That 20 minutes is where all of the story material came from. It's when you can get people out of their element and get unguarded that you really, kind of helps complete the story. And that's great when you have a lot of space and a big topic to expand on. How can you get, so this is the question that somebody submitted earlier, how can you get those elements of narrative, just a little bit of narrative and a little bit of storytelling when you've got to write tight and when you're writing a daily or a quick turnaround story?
I think it's a really great question. And I think there's really no, except for time constraints and that you're kind of stressed out. It's top of mind because I just turned the story in right before the webinar started. But so kind of a, standard story, like what's going on with the IV bags. Again, I tried to get a little history. This is not the first rodeo of this, right? There was Hurricane Maria in 2017. There was like a whole chemotherapy drug shortage due to something else. And you can say like, you don't have to say like when a tornado disabled a plant. I said when a tornado ripped the roof off a plant that makes 1/4 of the nation's injectable sterile drugs. So like just thinking about language and verbs, Steve loves those strong verbs. Again, it's maybe more important when you don't have a lot of time to vet your sources. I wasn't able to speak with her, but I found this amazing woman at the University of Utah who's been like tracking drug shortages for 20 years and had all these great quotes and comments when she was interviewed before. So I know she would have been great had I had more time. I was able to summarize some of her stuff from a congressional testimony she gave. And I think also like rather than sitting and waiting for the people to call back when you're on those short, you can look in, there's like almost every topic has a ton of information. Like because this has happened before, there was all these protocols in place that I could write about. Like you can leave IV bags hanging for 96 hours. That's allowed. That sounds so gross and like everyone's going to get those hospital infections. But those, and again, just like those little details, one hospital in Philadelphia is giving people Gatorade instead of using IVs. So that's like I think that went to the lead. That's like a cool detail that are going to make people's eyebrows perk up, right? Like Gatorade. It's totally fine if you're like not that sick and can actually drink. It's really not that different from an IV drip, but it's kind of interesting, right? So I think just again, looking for those details, interviewing the right people, keeping quotes short, looking for history and context that other stories aren't going to have. By researching. You don't have to interview all these people for that because all that information is out there.
And if I could add two that can be used on quick dailies, two literary techniques are two things we already discussed: dialogue and rhythm. You can control the rhythm, and that can propel readers forward. That can make points. You can do that in dailies. So those kind of techniques aren't just for big projects. How do you take complex topics, like basically everything you write, how do you take technical material and make it understandable to laymen? What's the trick, either in what you do or how you work with sources in making that happen?
Yeah. Well, okay, again, not to overuse the metaphor, but it's not my first rodeo. And as I don't know if you recall, if you knew this, Steve, when I was at the Times, but I was sort of like the youngest one on this, at the time, amazingly big, robust science and health team that had already like mapped out and taken all the good stuff, right? Like neuroscience, this, that. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll cover underwater seismology. And, I had these, not only was it science, it was like the least well, when Terrence Tao came to UCLA, math got sexy, but I was like covering these like obscure little areas of science because everyone else had like, no, this is mine. So anyway, I think it's very similar writing about race. Like you got to avoid jargon. And people don't even realize they're using it. And you would think people talking about like saving Black Lives Matter wouldn't use it, but they do, right? It's social determinants of health. It's race as a social construct. Like this is jargon that a lot of people just not in the field don't get. And they don't get it because they all go to meetings and they throw these words at each other and nod and stuff.
Yeah.
So, can you say that a different way? Like how would you explain this to your neighbor mowing the lawn? How would you like to your child's 5th grade teacher? Some people just can't do it. And so if they can't do it, you have to do it. You have to translate, you have to make a metaphor, you have to give an example. That's like, well, it's not mine, but the number of excess premature Black deaths is equivalent to a 747 fully loaded crashing every single day. A really famous health equity researcher said that, and I've never been able to get that out of my head. And I back to Sally's question, I'll tuck that in because you can't not get that, right? It's so visual.
Do you ever, oddly enough, I found that when I was editing religion stories, among my many roles at the Times, it was very common for religion writers to call back sources and read, like a sentence or paragraph to them. Am I expressing this correctly? And the rabbi or the imam or preacher would say, yeah, you could get away with it, or maybe say no. So they found, since that's a real minefield of dealing with accuracy with religion, it was fairly common to not share entire stories, but to read people little segments to just find out, can I say it this way for a layman? And that was a useful
we are
technique.
allowed to send like technical things. Sometimes people demand to have their quotes read back. I really hate it because I want a good quote that's like, I was just knocked off my socks or something. And then like, especially if you never email them, just read them, because then they'll say like, I was slightly perturbed by the thing that, they just make it boring. They make it written.
Yeah, right.
And, but it is good to check. So it's a fine line. And sometimes people might not we have to simplify. And scientists and academics don't like that. I'm sure everybody on this call has dealt with that. Like, no, it's this. Like, I'm sorry, we don't have footnotes in a news article. People don't. And I'm just amazed at the number of senior scientists that still don't get it. Even if they have dealt with the media, or I think are very used to being able to go back and forth with their internal news office and rewrite and challenge and change. And I think that's why I've read some great press releases. Some of them are beautiful. We have institutional writing awards, and there's great writing, but sometimes the press releases are so dry, and it's not the fault of the author. It's the fault of the
right. Kate, let's go back to you and questions from the crowd here.
to tell you that I'm here to say that we are at actually over a little bit over time, but rapid fire, favorite resources on writing, on storytelling, favorite inspiration, quickly, both of you. What are some of your favorites?
Okay, I'll be rapid. I mentioned Sharon Begley and Helen Branswell, who's now writing sadly about Marburg and in H1N1. Just read it, anything you can get your hands on from them. And I just love John Franklin. And there is an annotated, he wrote Mrs. Franklin's Monster, just a classic of a woman getting I think it was the first Pulitzer for explanatory journalism. And there's a Neiman storyboard. And then Open Notebook has so many great resources where they just go line by, I don't think I've never been asked to do them, but line by line, like why'd you decide this? Why'd you use this word? And you just really get in the head of the author, and they're just beautiful.
Steve, do you have any favorite resources to share?
A new one that I just started reading, this new book by Lane DeGregory, by the way, The Girl in the Window, is quite good, where she describes how she puts stories together. I am just like halfway through it. It's quite good. There are a lot of great books out there, of course, on writing well by Zinsser and all that. But something shorter, I would really recommend you read. I have to revisit this at least once a year. George Orwell's immortal essay, Politics and the English Language. Horrible title, but it is the most concise, valuable thing you'll ever read that explains about you let the meaning control the word, don't let the words control the meaning. I think he says in there, the worst thing you can do with words is surrender to them. And it's filled with all sorts of amazing advice. And of course, it's being Orwell, he does throw in the political elements of it all too. But Politics in the English Language, you can find it easily online. And I really revisit that about once a year. So I just want to say, I don't know if there's anything else, but I just want to say thanks for having me to this party. And Usha, my God,
Thank you.
We are not worthy. Okay.
Thank you so
both
much, Steve.
so much. And a thing that we haven't mentioned yet, we have a special surprise for those of you who've hung in here with us, and those who get the recording later, which is that we've linked to a lot of Usha's stories, and she was able to get a special discount code for folks to use to get a big discount on a subscription to STAT. And do you want to, we'll send the actual thing out by email, Usha, but did you want to say anything about that?
Our stories, my health equity stories are free to read, but we do have a limit per month of how many you can access. So I am able to give a code for a 75% off subscription if you want to read more. We'd love your support as well.
So we'll be sending that out to all of the registrants of this meeting. So thank you again to both of you. I really appreciate your time, appreciate all this good advice. The notes that we've taken are just absolutely incredible. This has been a very rich resource, a very good talk that will be in and of itself a very rich resource. To all the participants, thanks for hanging in there. When this call ends, you're going to get a survey. Please take it and let us know what you thought of today's conversation, as well as and what else you would like us to tackle in our next connector chats. Other than that, everybody, thank you all for tuning in today and have a wonderful day.
Okay. Well.